Welcome and thanks for joining us for this episode of the Mountaineers Books web series. I'm Doug Canfield, and this evening we're excited to have Debbie Miller with us. Debbie is the author of A Wild Promise, Prince William Sound, for which she worked closely with the photographer Hugh Rose. A Wild Promise is published by Braided River, the conservation imprint of Mountaineers Books. The subject of the book, Prince William Sound, is surrounded by the Chugach National Forest in Alaska. And within this forest, Prince William Sound is in a study area limbo. And by that, I mean that it has been a study area since 1980, so nearly 40 years. And during that time, the end result of the study area, the hoped for result anyway, is wilderness designation. So Debbie's going to tell us more about that and how to get this area out of limbo, perhaps. So Debbie knows this area really well, as she does most of Alaska since she's lived there for 43 years. Debbie is a writer, environmental educator, and adventurer. She has written several books on Alaska conservation topics and more than a dozen natural history books for children. Before we get going, I want to thank the Ocean Foundation for co-sponsoring this evening's presentation. The Ocean Foundation's mission is to support, strengthen, and promote those organizations dedicated to reversing the trend of destruction of ocean environments around the world. Debbie's presentation will run about 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation in the question box that you can see on the right side of your screen. So anyway, that's enough. Let's get started. Over to you, Debbie.
Okay, well, welcome everybody who's tuned in. It's a very dark evening here in Sitka, Alaska. The sun went down at about 3:30, and yet we have beautiful light, low-angle light that we love this time of year, and we have humpback whales actually that have been out on the channel of recent. Well, I'm so excited to share with you the magnificent area in the Chugach National Forest that is a wilderness study area. The actual formal name of the area that you're looking at in this first picture is the Nellie Wan College Fjord Wilderness Study Area. And take your eyes, follow that Tidewater Glacier as it winds up into the mountains. Those are some of the highest coastal mountains that we have in the world. They rise up very quickly to 13,000, 14,000 feet. And this is an area that gets sometimes 50 feet of snowfall in a year. So this is great stuff for making glaciers. As a result of all that snow from those high mountains, you have the largest concentration of tidewater glaciers in North America. And this area that we're looking at, that I'll be sharing with you, it includes the mountains, the glaciers, the alpine tundra that you see, the very light green, and as you come down to the water, you see the fringe of the Chugach National Forest, which is on the northern edge of the largest temperate rainforest in the world. So we are about an hour south of Anchorage as a crow flies, and these mountains that embrace Prince William Sound, they actually protect this area in a way. You really can't sense that civilization and the largest city in Alaska is just on the other side of those mountains, not far away, because when you're in Prince William Sound, there are so many bays, a dozen major fjords that look like this, and places where you can have a quiet wilderness where you only see maybe at one passing boat in a day. So I definitely fell in love with this area, and I'm happy to share it with you. Imagine this. You're paddling up College Fjord, which is one of the major fjords in this wilderness study area. You're looking in the distance at Harvard Glacier that's coming down from those mountains and a number of other smaller tributary glaciers. And this is part of a wilderness study area that's about the size of Yellowstone National Park. It's about 2 million acres. And that is of the whole Chugach Forest, National Forest, which is about a little over 5 million acres. So it represents about 35%, the study area, of the whole Chugach National Forest, which is the third largest national forest in America. What's interesting about these numbers that really surprised me when I started this project is that most of our national forests throughout America have designated formal wilderness. Some wilderness areas are very small, maybe 5,000, 10,000 acres, others considerably more. The Chugach National Forest is one of very few national forests in our country that does not have one formally designated acre of wilderness, which means you have the highest level of protection if it gets that wilderness status. And that's what we're striving for, is to get what you see here protected in that most protective status as wilderness. This is the discovery boat that I traveled on for many trips to learn about this area, where Dean Rand was the captain of this boat. Great guy. He passionately loves this place, so much so that he was generous enough to help sponsor our book. Otherwise, there would be no book. So we're very grateful for Dean and his love and passion and advocacy for protecting the wilderness study area and keeping it wild forever. The person who is most responsible for this book happening is Hugh Rose, the photographer. We've worked together on other projects. He's a great friend. We both have lived in Fairbanks in the past for many years. And we were working on another book in the Arctic called On Arctic Ground, which Braided River published. At the end of that project, Hugh convinced me that we should do a book about the wilderness study area in the Chugach Forest, largely because Hugh had spent nearly 20 years as a naturalist and guide working with Dean Rand on the discovery, and he had taken countless photographs, beautiful images of the area. So I decided I'd give it a go. His enthusiasm was contagious. And so I headed down to Prince William Sound in 2013 for my first look at this area, and I was awestruck. I also had a wonderful opportunity, thanks to the Forest Service and to Tim and Barbara Lydon, who you see here. They are the wilderness stewards for the Neliwan College Fjord Wilderness Study Area. And there was a wonderful artist in residence program. And for 2 summers, Tim and Barb took me out up many of these major fjords, across islands, into the forest, up into the alpine meadows and peat bogs. So I'm really grateful for having that opportunity to get out and to write, research, photograph over a 5-year period. I worked on this book. Now you'll be hearing a few sounds that'll actually take you to this place. And the sounds were recorded by my partner, Richard Nelson, who's an anthropologist and sound recording artist. And so we go out often and he records the voices of birds, of glaciers, of whatever is out in the wildness that we have of Alaska. So you'll be listening to some of those sounds this evening. This gives you an idea of how these tidewater glaciers staircase down from the mountains into the sea, with the discovery there off in the distance. It's an awe-inspiring kind of a view as you travel through this area. Your mouth is always wide open in your eyes because of the scenery and the spectacular nature of this area. Here's a little map that gives you an idea. If you look to the far left edge of the map, you'll see Anchorage right here. And here are the Chugach Mountains that ring Prince William Sound. And these are the fjords that we're looking at, where we traveled and studied the wildlife and the life on the islands, many, many islands that dot the Sound. And so on my research, I traveled as far north as up to the Harvard Glacier here, and as far south as Elrington Island down here, and to places like Glacier Island and Columbia Bay. You'll see that one of our largest glaciers in the region, Columbia Glacier. So you'll be looking at some of those places as we go through the pictures. A map. And Valdez, by the way, is right here. And the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 occurred here on Bly Reef. So just to give you that perspective, this area is just west of that and has been in a recovery mode since 1989. As you travel up College Fjord, this is what it looks like from an airplane. And this area was explored by John Muir, back in 1899 on his 7th and last trip to Alaska. And as a student of glaciers and a lover of glaciers, he was amazed by what he saw. He planned to come back and study the glaciers, but he never did. So this was his last trip to Alaska, and he wrote about it in many pages of journal writing and with sketches that I'll show in a bit here. Well, that's the sound of a calving glacier. You're hearing the ice shedding from the face of a 200 to 300 foot high face of a glacier. And the kayaker looks a little too close for my comfort, but this was a little bit foreshortened with a zoom lens, so maybe he wasn't quite that close. You've got to be careful around these glaciers when they calve. You have to keep your distance and be careful. But to hear the thundering sound of what I think of as living glaciers that have their own voices is really almost as powerful as the glaciers themselves, the visuals. And the colors. Nowhere have I seen more beautiful electric neon blues as I have on the inside of the icebergs of these glaciers that calve. Well, Hugh took a beautiful picture of a melting iceberg, and you can hear that popping sound, which we call Bergy seltzer. It sounds like champagne bubbles bursting or a fizzling kind of a pop drink. And that's the sound of all the compressed bubbles of air that have been trapped inside that dense ice. And as that ice melts, the bubbles burst and are released, and you start to hear that popping and cracking of the ice. Well, when I first heard that sound, I thought it was a bird, that sort of soft cooing. Little did I know until I got a little closer as we paddled very carefully through these icebergs that these were seal pups, harbor seal pups that were calling to their moms. And this area, these glacial fjords, are extremely important for harbor seals that haul out on the ice floes. And this is where they deliver their baby pups in the spring. They weigh about 24, 25 pounds. Imagine. They have a body temperature as a marine mammal that's close to our body temperature. And yet they have these little pups that slip out of their womb onto a solid ice floe that's pretty cold, pretty, what shall we say, just quite a change from being inside a mammal out onto a slab of ice. And they are the most wonderful little creatures to look at up close, the pups. This one looks like it's kind of waving at you. And in our kayaks, as we moved through these areas, we were very, very careful not to disturb the animals. And they seemed pretty much unafraid by us because we moved with great caution. And of course, we were using lenses that were zooming in on them. We weren't quite as close as the picture looks. Sea otters are throughout this area, and here's some good news. These poor sea otters really got hit hard by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. About 3,000, 4,000 of these animals perished. They were covered with the goo of oil, and they died because of that toxic nature of oil. Well, as of 2014, they've gradually come back. It's almost taken 30 years. They've come back to their pre-spill numbers, and we saw a lot of these wonderful sea otters throughout Prince William Sound and up the fjords. They're the smallest marine mammal we have in North America, with the most velvety, soft, protective coat of fur that I can think of. And here we've got stellar sea lions that we also see oftentimes hauled out on important islands like Glacier Island in this next picture. Well, they have quite the bellow, quite the roaring sound. They kind of sound like a cross between a lion and a hog, and they can make a lot of racket when they're hauled out on the beaches. And these are important areas for them in the summertime to rest, and they are considered an endangered species, this western population of stellar sea lions. In the olden days, going back 4,000, 5,000 years, you have a very traditional culture that still hunts sea otters and sea lions in this area, the Chugachmute people, and they use the sea lions not only for food for their families, the meat, but also the hides made a wonderful material, the tanned hides for kayaks, and the fat could be used for light, burning the oil for light and for heat in their dwellings. They had seasonal camps that were all scattered around the sound. For thousands of years, people have lived in this area. Well, the birds, I'm a bird lover, and it was wonderful to see the great numbers of seabirds that come into this area. And these are black-legged kittiwakes that like to nest on cliffs, on these little ledges. They'll lay one egg, and you wonder about how these chicks must think when they look down a precipice and they might be 100 feet above the water, knowing that they don't want to fall off when they can't fly. So a colony of kittiwakes, and then the puffins. You just can't help but just love them and smile when you see those bright beaks and the tufts that are going down their heads. I've seen them fly with as many as 10, 15 little oily fish, little sand lance, little capelin as they go to their burrows. And they actually burrow into a lot of the islands in Prince William Sound and lay one egg, and both parents take turns feeding that one chick. And so this is an important area for seabird colonies and nesting. A bird that's a lot more nondescript, not as colorful as a puffin, but is one of my favorites, the marbled murrelet. Here's a bird that is not quite like most of your seabirds that are colony nesters. These are solitary nesters, and for whatever reason, these birds have chosen to have two homes. Most of their life, they're on the ocean. They're at sea, and they're eating small little fish and other animals in the ocean. But when it comes to nesting, they actually fly into the forest, into the old growth parts of the forest where you have thick moss on the branches, and they lay one egg on a branch that might be 100 or 200 feet above the forest floor. And the nest might be 10 to 20 miles away from the sea. And the parents will take turns flying to and from that nest, feeding their one precious chick. And then when it's time for fledging, that little chick makes a beeline by instinct to the water where they'll spend most of their life until they go to nest. Humpback whales, powerful, powerful creatures that we see in Prince William Sound. One of the things that I learned through my research is the importance of the glaciers, these 21 glaciers that feed into the Sound, how important it is that those glaciers are grinding the bedrock of the mountains, bringing those minerals, the iron, the phosphates, other organic material that comes into that seawater, and fresh water mixing with that seawater, which creates the perfect environment for plankton, for zooplankton, for little oily fish like capelin and sand lance and herring and krill. It's actually the glacier, to me, I used to think of glaciers as a force that carved out valleys and mountains. And what I've learned is that the glaciers do far more than that. They bring in all of these nutrients so that they are the building blocks for all of the life that we have that is connected to plankton and zooplankton and all the little fish and the big fish. And the whales are actually made of the pulverized bedrock of those mountains. One of my favorite pictures that Hugh took is of this doll porpoise. And I love this picture because it has the forest reflected in the wake that the porpoise has created. This is one of the fastest swimming marine mammals in the world. It looks a bit like a smaller version of an orca or a killer whale. And you feel in this picture what I have felt in the years of paddling through this area, that the forest, the glaciers, the water, it's one living mosaic that's all connected. And that's what makes this area so special. You have birds and animals that are connected to both land and sea. This is one of the largest glaciers that we have. In Alaska, the Columbia Glacier. It's also one of the fastest retreating glaciers in the world. This was an astonishing moment for me when I had my tent perched on a terminal moraine right near where you're looking at the face of this glacier. This picture was taken in 1983. And when Hugh was flying in this area this past summer, he took another picture that closely matches this one. But you will see a tremendous difference. About 15 miles of ice has melted and disappeared in that time since 1983. And you're looking at a glacier that's about 3 miles wide and maybe 1,500 feet thick. You're only seeing the very top surface of that glacier. A lot of that ice is invisible, carving out the fjord that you're looking at. So this is what this same exact place looked like this summer. Same island, Heather Island, and you can see all of that ice that was there has turned into Columbia Bay. It was an astonishing moment to see that, and this is all because of climate change and a warming, global warming climate that we have. So even with the 50, 60 feet of snow that this area might receive, your warmer temperatures end up melting more than accumulating. This area was completely full of ice when John Muir visited College Fjord. This is the Yale arm of College Fjord. You can see an island out here that would have been completely buried in ice going back in 1899. And then today you can walk on this new land and you get a sense that the glacier was just there. You look at the bedrock and you see the striations, the etching of the debris on the belly of the glacier that went across those rocks and left tracks. And it's almost as you're standing there that you can smell the glacier, that it was just there so recently. So glaciers create new habitat as they retreat. And that island is also a very important nesting area for Arctic terns and for gulls. When you're hiking, and this is on that same island with Harvard Glacier in the distance there, you can't help but just pause and just take it all in and savor it and be grateful that we have this part of our world that is as primitive and as wild as you can imagine. There's no industry here. There are no roads here. There are no cities here. The closest towns would be Valdez and Whittier and one small community on Evans Island near the boundary of the WSA, or the Wilderness Study Area. This is Vassar Glacier, one of the tidewater glaciers that has become landlocked. So when Muir was here in 1899, this particular glacier came down into the water. And today you can see that it's landlocked and it continues to retreat. Mountain goats, you have to love them. If you can see them, oftentimes they're hard to spot because they're way up in the high country. Sure-footed, beautiful animals. We're on the northern fringe of their range. And John Muir, again, when he was on this particular expedition in 1899, the Harriman expedition, maybe some of you have heard of it, they actually came into this fjord. This is Barry Arm. And when they arrived, this was all iced in. The three glaciers that you see there were together. They were joined together that long ago, and now they've receded into three separate glaciers. And this was a great exploration moment for the expedition, because they snuck around this corner and they discovered a new fjord, Harriman Fjord, which they thought for a time that it might be a new route, like to get to the Northwest Passage. Of course, it ended at Harriman Glacier, and they explored this area and named a lot of the place names on the map were from that expedition. And this is a page from John Muir's journal that shows you what it looked like as they sailed into Barry Arm, into Harriman Fjord. It was a wall of ice, and they barely had enough room to get around that corner. He was quite a sketcher as well as a wonderful writer. Believe it or not, that's the sound of a bald eagle. That always surprised me when I first heard a bald eagle. The voice to me didn't match the bird and all its majesty, but we see lots of bald eagles in these areas, particularly near streams where salmon spawn. And there are at least 2,000 different streams and rivers that pour into Prince William Sound that offer pristine water, well-oxygenated water, perfect habitat for 4 different species of salmon. Here are chum salmon that are making their way in shallow water going up a creek. And this is great food source for bald eagles, for bears. A black bear here. I love this picture that Hugh shot that's in the book of a black bear that's going up a pretty steep precipice. Probably salmon somewhere along that stream. As you walk across the land, leaving the water, you reach a number of areas that are what we call peat bogs, where the land is really squishy and soft beneath your feet. And there are lots of beautiful ponds, lily pads, river otters. You might find paths in these sorts of areas, and lots of songbirds. But what's nice about this wilderness study area is you have the forest, and it's rather an open forest. The trees are smaller than the Tongass National Forest. It's harder to grow here. And so the land is a little bit more open and more inviting for you to hike through it and see vistas like you're seeing here. Along the way, when I was out with the Forest Service, I met a wonderful woman who studies hummingbirds. And this is a rufous hummingbird, beautiful picture. And Kate McLaughlin, who lives, at one time, she's in Cordova now, but she did live on Evans Island when I visited her. She became an expert banner, and she banded one summer 500 different rufous hummingbirds. And probably her most surprising, astonishing moment was one day she opened that cage and she carefully picked out a hummingbird that had a band on it that came from Tallahassee, Florida. And to this day, it's the longest known migration for any hummingbird that traveled from as far away as Tallahassee, Florida, to Evans Island in Prince William Sound, where it was likely born. A little bird that weighs about as much as a penny. It just seems like a miracle. Well, I mentioned islands. Here's the largest island in Prince William Sound, Knight Island. Has some pretty big mountains you see back here that rise up from the sea. It's a beautiful, beautiful island with lots of beautiful bays and coves. And during the Exxon Valdez oil spill, these beaches that you see here were unfortunately, tragically covered with oil. Since that time, there was, of course, a huge cleanup effort, and then just the working of the sea gradually over time. The oil disperses. Some of it is trapped in the substrate, deep in the substrate, tar balls that will remain forever. I think they've determined that if they tried to dig up all the beaches to remove that oil that's in place, there would be way more environmental damage than just leaving it as is. But This was a tragic time for us. We lost a lot of wildlife. There were huge, dramatic long-term effects. The herring population still is depressed. The sea otters have come back. The orcas are still there. Although a good reminder about how toxic oil is, there is one particular transient pod of killer whales that at the time of the oil spill, there were about 22, 23 animals, and many of those animals perished in the spill. Today, there are only 7 left in that particular pod with no females of reproductive age. So this pod, they know, the biologists that study them know this pod will become extinct, and they even speak their own language that no other pod speaks. So these are sort of the sad reminders that we have to remember that oil, as much as we use it in our airplanes and our cars, it is a toxic substance when we transport it. And could something like this happen again? Hopefully never again, but we have to be vigilant and do things as safely as possible. It is a place, Prince William Sound, of healing, of resilience. It gives me great hope to know that over the 5 years that I explored this area, I didn't find oil on the beaches. I saw beautiful beaches. I saw a range of wonderful animals, marine mammals, seabirds, songbirds, terrestrial mammals. It's a rich, rich mosaic of life. And I think I'll close with the last picture that really says it all. To me, the voice of this particular whale sings a song that we don't understand the language, but if we listen really hard, we might begin to think about what this whale might be saying. So the whale really has that last voice with the Chugach Mountains rising in the distance. And this is a wonderful, wonderful picture that Hugh took. And the reason why we were so moved to write the book and include these images for the public was that we both felt that there was such a need to protect this area forever. Lasting protection is different than a study area. And Congress now has had nearly 40 years to act on this, and they just haven't. A wilderness proposal has never advanced in Congress. Now, the Forest Service has just finished its draft management plan. And in that management plan was an alternative D that recommended that about 1.7, 1.8 million acres of the study area would be protected as wilderness under that alternative. That was the strongest alternative in terms of the number of acres. And so this was a good thing that we have that on the books. There have been other management plans that have recommended a little less wilderness. Some, that kind of pared away some of the original wilderness study area land. So this gives you a glimpse of what is one of the most magnificent places that I've traveled to and studied in Alaska. And I think now it's time for Q&A.
That was great. Thank you, Debbie. I'm a lower 48er, so those pictures were really new to me. The first question, Mike, this is from Michael, and he says, if this wilderness proposal were granted in the Chugach, how might this designation affect efforts to designate wilderness in, and I'm not sure if he means ANWR, he has spelled it ANWF as an acronym. Perhaps he means ANWR. I ask this in the context of the current political situation in DC.
Well, this is something that it takes a long time to get a wilderness designation. I'll be really honest with you. We've worked for many decades trying to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and we continue that fight, even though Congress last December passed a bill that authorized oil drilling in the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd on the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. So that actually happened in an area that we have pushed for a wilderness designation for. Well, we have not given up on that one. And we are very hopeful that we have a new Congress, a new House of Representatives, and we have a lot of allies that agree that you don't open up wildlife refuges and turn them into oil fields. That is why we created wildlife refuges, are to protect the wildlife and the land, not to create oil fields. So we will continue our work on that, on the conservation front, on the part of many groups that care about the Arctic Refuge. And there are so many other lands that are in need of continued vigilance and protection of areas like the Greater Staircase Escalante monument that has recently been pared back, some lands that have wilderness character. We have to continue working on all these fronts to protect the places that we cherish around the United States. The Neliwan College Fjord Wilderness Study Area, it's a 2 million acre area, the size of Yellowstone National Park. And the Chugach is one of the very few forests in our country that has no designated wilderness, not 1 acre. And that's unusual. Most forests have designated wilderness, nothing to the scale that we have in Alaska. And that is what is so special about our state, is that we have most of the wilderness in the United States. And it's up to us as stewards to protect it, these gifts that are so special for everybody in America. So it may take years to get this done. We may not have a wilderness proposal advance through Congress for some time, but we need to keep raising our voices when we can to our congressmen and our senators, to the supervisor of the National Forest, to commenting on management plans that the Forest Service may create. These are just little steps that we can take in a way to reach the goal of a formal wilderness. And it may take a long time, but this is just the start. We're planting a seed with this book, and we hope that people fall in love with it as we have, and maybe visit the area and work to help protect it through time.
Perhaps this is a question in the same vein, thinking of ANWR, or the National Wildlife Refuge, because Tim asks, what are the threats to the Neliwan Wilderness Study Area? Is it also natural resource extraction, or what are the major threats here?
Major threats to the area would be, I guess I would say, recreation is a pretty major one, because our numbers have really gone up with people coming into the area, and there's a need to monitor the area and make sure that places don't get overused. There have been things like illegal chainsaw use, people that hunt, where in certain fjords bear baiting is allowed, where people actually cleaned up one of the bear bait stations where somebody had built a tree house and they had put some stinky bait by a tree, and then they sat up in the tree house and waited for a black bear to come in to hunt the black bear, which doesn't really seem like hunting to me, but this is allowed. And so you do have issues with use, would be a sort of a long-term threat, and you need the monitoring, you need guidelines to make sure we keep that wilderness character. That would be one. But also there are mining claims that are in the wilderness study area, and the area is not closed to mineral leasing. So someone could come in, a party could come in and develop a mine, would have access to develop those mining claims. Forestry issues, the trees are smaller, which in some ways protect the Chugach forest. There isn't a whole lot of interest in commercial logging because the trees are pretty small compared to the Tongass National Forest that has these huge ancient trees that many of us work to protect those old growth areas that have such, cathedral trees. Those are the three that come to mind when I think of use logging, which is not too much of a worry, but possibly mining down the road as we search for more rare minerals, and then the recreation use, just making sure that we're careful that we don't have hundreds of people using the same fjord and damaging the resources. And that's why we have people like Tim Leiden and Barbara Leiden, who are wonderful wilderness stewards for the Chugach National Forest, and they monitor these areas. It's important.
And how about oil spills? John has asked whether another spill like the Exxon Valdez could happen again.
Oh, really good question. I mean, that is a huge threat, and I should have mentioned that, as well as climate change. That's sort of the overarching threat to this area, because we may lose the glaciers through time, so they're kind of at risk, the glaciers. But as you say, could we have another oil spill? I would hope that we would never have another spill like we did in 1989, 11 million gallons of oil. Since that time, we now have double hull tankers. We have tugboats that escort every tanker in and out of Valdez, where everything is done a lot more carefully as it was done in 1989. And our cleanup system is 100 times better. We have many, many boats, many people that have been trained to quickly react if there was such a spill. But certainly, humans make mistakes. And you could have a spill just like we read about spills every month of the year. There's usually a spill somewhere in the world. And while we hope that it would never happen again, that is a risk we take by using fossil fuels and being dependent on oil for our airplanes, for our cars. If we move away from that and develop clean energy, and we continue to curb our use of oil, that can only reduce the risk for spills in a place as beautiful as Prince William Sound.
Okay, Julie, this is our last question. Julie asks, in the 5 years of exploring this area, did you have any unexpected scary moments?
Oh yes, had a few. Had a few, but the one that comes to mind that, it was a pretty scary night. This was in 2014, and there was this big storm in Prince William Sound. And I was with Tim and Barbara Leiden on the Forest Service boat, and of course they're amazing people, both amazing captains. And we were seeking the shelter in a bay, a long bay actually, and I was out washing dishes on the step on the back of this aluminum good sized Forest Service boat, and the plates were about to blow away. It was that windy, and I was trying to, keep my balance and not fall in the water. And suddenly I looked over my shoulder, and all of a sudden the rocks were a lot closer than they had been, 10 minutes previously. And next thing I know, Tim comes running out of the cabin, and Barb's at the wheel, and we've dragged anchor because of these horrific winds, and I think the boat's going to pile into the rocks. And of course, these two amazing captains, they knew exactly what to do, and Tim is throwing the orders to Barb, and she's at the wheel doing what she's supposed to do, and Tim's got the pole, and he's pushing the boat off from the rocks. And we don't want to wreck the Forest Service boat. That would be really bad. But they did an awesome job, and we were fine. But there was a moment, and it was just pouring horizontal rain and wind in it. And this is what happens with climate change. We get more severe storms and microbursts that can occur with all that extra water vapor in the sky coming off the ocean. Sometimes you get these unexpected big storms.
Okay. So we have no more questions, but thank you very much, Debbie. And please thank Hugh Rose when you see him for his wonderful photos. Yes. The audience, you should know that Braided River really sort of specializes in these photo-driven books so that people can see these areas that most of us don't have the chance to travel to on our own. And you can see the wildlife that lives there and what it is that's really worth protecting.
Right.
Yep. So thanks also to our audience. I'm sorry, did you have something else?
I was just going to say, I know you archived this program, and for those people that view this program at a later date, if you have any questions, you can always email me or contact me through my author website, which would be debbiemilleralaska.com, or you can go to Braided River to the website, and there's a lot of information on what you can do as far as acting. We're going to keep track of what happens to the Forest Service draft management plan, and any updates that come up, we'll post that on the Braided River site. The Alaska Wilderness League is a conservation group that I'm involved with. They also will be tracking this issue. And so Alaska Wilderness League is another conservation group that will be on top of this, so that if you are interested and want to learn more about the Chugach National Forest and protecting the wilderness, you can refer to those sites, and I'm happy to communicate with readers about the book or any questions you might have.
Hey, that does bring up a question for me. So there was a comment period this last summer, isn't that correct? Does that
Yes.
mean that the whole issue is moving? Is there momentum then?
Well, this is, we're the comment period for the draft management plan is closed. That ended on November 1st. And then the Forest Service, they will issue a final plan that will be, not sure when that will come out. I think it's supposed to be this coming winter. And then at that point, there may be a time period where people can comment about what they think about the plan. I think it's a pretty final plan because they got the comments in, but I'm sure the public can comment, throughout this next year about where they are with the plan and with the wilderness recommendation. And for example, let's say they adopt alternative D or one of the wilderness alternatives. This would give us cause to say, wow, now we can hope that the agency has this recommendation that might be advanced to Congress or to a committee who might look at this area for a possible wilderness designation. We might be able to find someone to sponsor a bill to bring this forward. And it may take years to do this, but this is the start and the hope that we have.
Okay, so that's great. Yep, audience, we'll be sending you a recording, a link to a recording of this show in just a couple of days. And along with that, we'll be sending you a discount code that you can use on mountaineersbooks.org and to receive a 20% discount on this book. But the book is also available wherever books are sold. And so you can, you can find it in lots of places, your local bookstore, for example. Make a great Christmas gift. A Wild Promise is a hardback with approximately 100 color photos to illustrate Debbie's essays. And like I say, if you didn't catch that code, don't worry about it. We're going to send you an email in a couple of days. So our next web presentation will be in late January, nothing in December. With the world-renowned avalanche expert Bruce Tremper, and we hope you'll join us for that one too. In the meantime, we really wish you a wonderful holiday season, and we thank you again for joining us tonight. Good night, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks.